And we are live. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us on our very first event for the spring semester to the University of Arizona Debate Series public forum on this resolution, Break Up Big Tech. We appreciate you joining us. We had a great semester last semester going virtual for the very first time. We got a lot of really great views and a lot of really great viewer questions, which is one of the things we'll be changing tonight. We'll be taking audience questions for our debaters as we go. So if you'd like to look at the chat below, we'll have a Google form for you to submit your questions so we can vet it. And we will be asking them of our debaters roughly halfway through the broadcast. As is usually the case, the form is going to run like this. We will talk to our debater for a little bit at the very beginning. Afterwards, we'll have an Oxford-style debate that runs 3 rounds. The first round will be opening statements from either our affirmative or our negative team. Then we'll have our second round where people will be able to question and answer each other. They'll be able to see each other a little bit and answer my questions and yours once you submit them. And then finally, we'll have our third round of closing statements from the affirmative and negative teams. As is usually the case with Oxford-style debate, you are the voters and you are the ones who decide the ultimate. That means you get to vote both at the beginning and at the end of tonight's debate. So please vote now, if you will, on our Google form in the chat, or if you're watching on YouTube in the event description. Vote now to let us know what you think before hearing any of the debaters on the resolution Break Up Big Tech. You'll at the end of our event and tell us what you think after you hear our debaters talk. And the winners will be declared by who changes the audience the most from the beginning to the end, rather than who gets the most votes, because here we're all about elevating productive discourse. A few announcements before we begin so that everyone's really clear on a few things. First of all, we'd like to announce that our next debate that's going to be upcoming on February 4th at 7 p.m. will be a debate on debate itself. We thought we'd get a little meta here at the University of Arizona Debate Series, and the solution will be America's political debates miss the mark. America's political debates miss the mark. We'll be talking about that in 2 months today, again, live on Facebook. And we would also like to announce the 3rd annual Wildcat Cup. In case you are unaware, the Wildcat Cup is a national tournament hosted by the University of Arizona Debate Series for high school students nationwide. We know it'll be very different this year, having gone virtual. We have a record-breaking amount of students this year, and we're really, really looking forward to them participating. Again, please make sure that you vote before you hear any of our debaters speak right at the beginning, and then you can vote again at the end to let us know exactly how it is that you decide. And again, our audience questionnaire will be down below. So as you listen to our debaters speak, you can go ahead and ask a question. But as is usually the case, we have an absolutely fantastic guest speaker with us here tonight to give you a little bit of context to our resolution before you hear our debaters speak, so that you have a little bit of a better idea how you should vote. And we are very happy to have University of Arizona's own Professor Jeremy Vetter. Jeremy Vetter is an associate professor at the University of Arizona in the history department. He is the winner of the 2008 Philip J. Pauley Prize for the best first book of the history of science in the Americas. He teaches the history of American capitalism at the U of A and is the author of Field Life, Science in the American West during the Railroad Era. So please welcome with us tonight, Professor Jeremy Vetter. Thank you for joining us, Professor Vetter.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here to discuss this really important topic and to provide you some historical perspective about it. So I'm going to give a brief historical overview at the beginning, and then take a little bit of Q&A if anybody has any aspects of that history you'd like to have clarified. What I'm going to try to do is focus on the history of antitrust law in the United States and business formation, large corporate mergers, that sort of thing, stretching mainly from the late 19th century to the present. As mentioned, I do teach the history of American capitalism as a 200 level course here at the University of Arizona. It's a tier 2 course, so I get a lot of students who aren't even history majors in there. So I've enjoyed having discussions about this history with students from a variety of different backgrounds, some of them from the business school or other parts of the university. But this is just one of many topics I cover in that course. But as was alluded to with my book, I actually was originally trained, my PhD is in the history of science from the University of Pennsylvania, where our department was really a history of science, technology, and medicine. So the technology aspect of this does interest me as well to some extent. I wasn't going to talk about that specifically, but I do have colleagues who are in graduate school with me who study the history of big tech and that sort of thing. Although that's not what I work on myself. As was alluded, my first book was about the history of field science in the American West during the railroad age. So people who did work outdoors like ecology and agricultural research and that sort of thing. Anyway, so what I'd like to do is provide a kind of a thumbnail overview in really the simplest possible way of the history of regulation of big businesses in the United States. I don't have a lot in here about kind of global issues, although there are a lot of global issues coming up, particularly with regard to the way that the United States has unofficially become the arbiters of a lot of global regulation of this. Now, of course, like the EU has their own regulatory regime they've tried to impose on big tech. But generally, the United States has been in a position to regulate big tech in ways that have ramifications for everybody all around the world. But I'm going to confine myself mostly to the history of antitrust regulation and business regulation in the United States. As a historian, of course, I want to take it back as far as possible. I think I'll start mainly, though, in about 1890, which is generally thought to be the kind of origin point of antitrust law in the United States, with the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which is still considered the kind of fundamental legal foundation for antitrust regulation of big business in the US. If I had a lot more time, there's an interesting story to be told dating even back into the colonial period about the development of corporations as business forms and the gradual process during the 19th century by which these corporations became endowed with personhood. That is to say, having certain rights that had to be respected in the law. And there's a lot of interesting court cases. The Supreme Court gradually became more and more favorable towards kind of giving big business in its corporate form rights and that sort of thing. And that's an interesting story. But as far as regulating businesses that have become so large that people have become concerned that they might be exercising inordinate market power, that they need to be reined in, that history dates back mainly to around 1890 at the national level. So starting after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, that was a period traditionally in US history called the Gilded Age. A lot of large corporations started to be formed from the 1870s onwards, first and foremost in the railroad sector, which is sort of related to the book that I wrote because of its influence on the sciences. But besides all that, one of the most interesting aspects of railroads is they were one of the first large-scale kind of big businesses that people became concerned about becoming too powerful. And so people began to think about what ways they need to be regulated. Of course, that wasn't the only one. There's a lot of other famous, I mean, the most famous railroad that became famous in kind of public discourse was the Southern Pacific Railway, known as the Octopus, that is the largest railway, ran all the way to the West Coast in California. Had a lot of negative media attention because of the stranglehold they had over the farmers and other small-scale entrepreneurs and their ability to haul their freight to market and that sort of thing. And so there was a lot of discourse around them. The other big company that got a lot of attention, especially from journalists like Henry Demarest Lloyd, was the Standard Oil Company. The Standard Oil Company was, as the fossil fuel age was dawning and the transition from coal to oil was starting to occur, a lot of concern about Standard Oil under Rockefeller. There were other companies, steel companies, that sort of thing, that were growing large during this time period. And so Congress was concerned that these large firms would, because of their market power, be able to dictate terms, use their monopoly power to create imperfect markets that would disadvantage everyone else in the economy. Despite the passage of Sherman Antitrust Act, there was still a lot of merger events going on and businesses growing larger. In fact, what's known as the Great Merger Movement in American history was in the late 1890s, early 1900s. So the Sherman Antitrust Act did not stop all merger activity. And during the Progressive Era, which is in the early 20th century, a series of presidents enacted various policies and laws to try to rein in business further. The Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914 was the most best known of these during the Woodrow Wilson administration early on, to try to strengthen antitrust law. One of the oddities of the early antitrust law under Sherman was that it was applied to labor unions as well as big businesses. And so they tried to rectify that later on because it ended up getting used as a cudgel against the very organizations that were trying to fight corporate power. But after Clayton, that was reined in somewhat. But then, the antitrust law has had its ups and downs since then. There have been time periods, especially during, say, the New Deal of the 1930s, when antitrust law was strengthened. There were members of Congress like Wright Patman who were strong proponents of local small independent businesses and who feared the growth of large retail chains and other large supply chain controlling firms that would make it difficult for small businesses to compete. And so they championed laws that would protect, for example, large retail firms from deliberately setting low prices to drive out their competitors, and thereby, because they small businesses, little mom and pop shops, they didn't really have any margin to be able to just, endure a period of, Amazon did sort of the same thing later on, which I guess gets close to this, but you can't really, you don't have the amount of reserves saved up to weather a kind of price war if you're a small business. So they were trying to prevent this practice from larger retail chains and other firms. But really, I would say that in the broadest terms, that kind of regime from the Progressive era and the New Deal up to the early to mid 1970s was a time period when antitrust law was relatively strong. It was rigorously enforced with various attempts in, every so often to try to strengthen it further. And so one thing that naturally arose out of that situation is this type of business agglomeration that's known as a conglomerate. So conglomerates, it's an interesting debate whether the current tech firms are conglomerates in the traditional sense, but we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. But the conglomerate wave really kind of crested during the 1960s. So a conglomerate is basically, instead of creating monopoly power by either horizontally integrating by buying up your competitors or vertically integrating by buying up, say, your suppliers, the other way you could grow as a business and not run afoul of antitrust law was to acquire unrelated businesses. So during the 1960s, the strong antitrust enforcement meant that businesses didn't have as much wiggle room to grow by vertically or horizontally integrating, so they had to become conglomerates if they wanted to grow large, meaning that they had, they acquired unrelated companies or companies in different sectors, so they weren't in the same market, so they couldn't develop that kind of market power that you would have, say, if you were integrating horizontally, or the control you'd have over your supply chain if you integrated vertically. Anyway, so those conglomerates, there's a whole debate over how effective they were. They tended to fall out of favor by a lot of business theorists afterwards for a variety of reasons. There was the idea that a conglomerate firm, even though they were in a lot of different sectors, there were some kind of generalized business competencies that they could share across different sectors, like running their payroll or internal information flows within corporations. So there's kind of general business skills that would enable them to profitably manage a variety of different unrelated firms. But a lot of other people thought it wasn't a very good thing. The idea was you diversify as well. So if your company was in, say, chemicals and electronics and something else, you could, and real estate or something, if there was a bad economic situation in one of those sectors, then the other sector could, maybe be doing better. So it's kind of the same reasoning behind why people want to invest in diversified, like stock funds and that sort of thing, mutual funds and that sort of thing today, but it was within a company. So the company could do better in this area for now and in that other area later. That all kind of fell out of fashion, but I think the more kind of cynical explanation is what happened is that starting in the late 1970s, a whole different theory of antitrust law emerged, which has been, until about 5 years ago, dominant and even across different partisan administrations. So antitrust enforcement has been relatively weak since the late 1970s. And this permitted firms to grow larger by acquiring horizontally their competitors, and it permitted vertical integration type mergers as well more easily. And so there was really no need to engage in these more sprawling conglomerate forms of organization. They could just acquire their competitors, and it was much easier than it used to be. Now, there were still some big antitrust actions even into the early 80s. The last big kind of famous one in the early 80s was the breakup of AT&T into all the kind of baby bells, they called them. But generally speaking, antitrust regulation became much weaker after the 70s. Now, this was all a new kind of theory of antitrust that was promulgated largely out of the University of Chicago and their law and economics program at the University of Chicago Law School. Most famous figure, there's Richard Posner, and then the most famous one, Robert Bork, is the most colorful, famous figure in the kind of new thinking about antitrust. He was actually initially famous because he worked in Nixon's administration, and he's the one who eventually fired the special prosecutor at Nixon's behest after the other people over him resigned rather than do that. So he was kind of famous for doing Nixon's bidding and firing the special prosecutor at Watergate. But then he became really famous for writing a book in the late 70s called The Antitrust Paradox, which he argued that you don't need strong antitrust laws the way that people used to think you do, because consumer welfare could be benefited even more by just simply having cheaper prices. And maybe the large firm would give people cheaper prices, so therefore consumer welfare is being served, so particularly in the short term, so we don't really need to worry about big firms. And of course, that becomes the basis upon which a lot of legal decisions are changed and mergers and acquisitions are permitted that would not have been permitted before that time period. So, I mean, it used to be when I first started teaching history of American capitalism, the company we would talk about would be something like Walmart. You know, they got really big and they could squeeze their suppliers, but that was justified because in the eyes of the people who supported that, because it gave consumers cheap prices. So you go to Walmart and get cheap stuff because Walmart was basically acting as a kind of strongman to get the suppliers to charge cheap prices. So it could be justified as a consumer welfare measure. Now, of course, are the big tech firms. Those are the ones that are getting the most attention. And I would say up till about 5 years ago, this was a real sleeper issue. And not very many people were talking about it. It was almost like there was a bipartisan consensus that it wasn't just Republicans. There were a lot of Democrats, I think under Clinton, weren't too terribly concerned about it either, as far as I'm concerned. So it was kind of a backwater issue. But then with the rise of big tech, I think in the last 5 years, there's become a kind of new, like strong antitrust movement. And that's, I guess, what's the topic of discussion for today in some regards, is this new movement. And I think of legal scholars like Lena Khan, who wrote the really path-breaking article, I have it over here so I can remember the title, Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which is about the new antitrust issues raised by firms like Amazon. And I don't want to get too much into all of that because I know that's your subject of debate. And so I'm giving you the historical. But the last thing I'll just end on is saying that there are this word of a conglomerate, which I was associating with the 1960s, has been used in some respects to refer to the big tech companies as well, in that they are oftentimes, like Amazon is not just doing their core service, they're also investing in all kinds of other spin-off and side projects. You know, like Amazon has their own book publisher, for example, that publishes books. It's kind of independent. I think that a degree, these kind of conglomerates are really quite different from the conglomerates of the 60s because they exist in an era of more lax antitrust enforcement. And so, I mean, the reality is if you are like let's say Amazon has a book publisher over here or something that does this over there, it's not unrelated to their core businesses because they operate as a platform. It's somewhat more related. So it's a different kind of conglomerate, if you want to call it a conglomerate. It's a conglomerate that has aspects of vertical integration to it oftentimes. But of course, that's always been the case, that there's been some fuzziness about the way these words get defined. But being a conglomerate now, getting involved in several different lines of work is a very different proposition from doing that in the 60s. So it leads to different forms of business organization. So I better not say anything more because I don't want to steal any thunder from the debaters. And I have a feeling I'm already starting to.
No, you're not at all. I appreciate it. And that actually gives really, really great context for the debate that we're going to go into. I do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind, just to follow up. So obviously, one of the things that we tend to think of when we hear that kind of history is we sort of hear that when these corporate consolidations are going on or conglomerates are being made, we often fear the word monopoly, right? That we don't want companies to be able to monopolize. And that seems like it's sort of like an objectively bad thing. So just to even out the sides here tonight, from a consumer perspective, and I know that you had already touched on this, Professor Vetter, from a consumer perspective, what might be beneficial about these corporate conglomerates, about corporations becoming larger and larger and acquiring each other horizontally or vertically?
Right. Yeah. Well, being a historian, I'll answer that in terms of what have people argued is advantageous about this, as opposed to what I personally think.
Right. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So I think that the number one argument is the one I already mentioned, which is in fact sort of the core of Robert Bork and Richard Posner's kind of new interpretation of antitrust law in the late 70s coming out of Chicago, which is that it might actually benefit consumers to have these large companies because the companies might produce cheaper prices or better output. But there's other arguments made having to do at various times. If you go all the way back to the early 20th century, the telecom companies back then, like AT&T that existed back then, they would have argued that there's economies, there's sort of network effects and economies of scale. And I think that applies to a lot of big tech. So economies of scale, simply you can be more efficient if you're larger, and just big size generates certain efficiencies just by virtue of being big. The other side, though, the network aspect of it is a kind of legit issue. I mean, economists talk about things like natural monopolies, but you've got, like with a company like Facebook, you've got, or you could say a telecom company back in the early time period, it's very inefficient for different companies to be putting like telecom lines next to each other kind of duplicatively. And it's much easier if you're on the one network that everybody's already on, because then it's all tied together and you can communicate with anybody. But if you want to have competition and like a national telecom network, you have to have some way for people to move their communications from one network to the other kind of seamlessly. Otherwise, there could be jumping, they're going to be, if the person you're talking to in the East Coast is not on the same network as you, it's going to be, there's going to be some way to connect the two networks together. Sure, but it's oftentimes inefficient for you to have duplicative, it's like 8 different companies all trying to lay phone lines in the same place. So
sure,
it's kind of things that seem like natural monopolies. Now, of course, there's a whole other side, which is maybe they should be public utilities. And that's, I don't know if you're going to get into that issue at all. Sure. In this state, it's sort of closely related to the question of breaking up big tech, but different, somewhat different.
Yeah, no, I would be surprised if that didn't come up tonight. I'll ask one last question. I know that I don't want to keep you too long or have you go too sort of deep into the hole on this, but I know you had alluded to before the fact that the support had sort of become warmed up to the idea of sort of corporate personhood throughout the 20th century. In as succinct a way as possible, is there a way to sort of sum up what their sort of reasoning were? Like what was the argument for embracing that sort of corporate personhood in the 20th century?
You mean back in the 19th century?
Yeah.
About the kind of gradual giving of rights to corporations.
Yeah.
So, this was never there were always debates about this, and there were vigorous dissents oftentimes. And for example, Thomas Jefferson, later in his life, was very hostile towards some of the early decisions, like the Dartmouth College decision that allowed corporate charters to supersede kind of legislative action, as if, because the thing about corporations they can exist indefinitely. They don't have natural lifespans. So sure. Even if the people who founded them have died and been buried, the corporation could keep going on. And so he worried that giving corporations personhood rights when they can't. But the argument made against this was that, well, I mean, there were a lot of different arguments made against it, but that allowing people to freely enter into contracts was a kind of way to promote more innovative forms of business organization, and that if everybody involved in the transactions was freely consenting to enter into them, then they had to be observed in a way, and that I guess part of it was they didn't want, the people who argued in favor of this didn't want political interference. Of course, it's political always whenever you're defining that certain entities can exist and have certain.
Right.
But they didn't want the prospect of, say, a state legislature being upset about what a corporation was doing and then saying, oh, well, we're going to tell you can't do that. And it would interfere with their kind of freedom of business opportunity that maybe a sole proprietorship that wasn't corporate organized couldn't do. So it would create kind of a not level playing field. I mean, I could get into there's a whole economic theory behind why limited liability corporations are beneficial and all that. And I don't know if I want to get into that right now, but in terms of personhood, a lot of it was based on there might be popular, what do we want to call it? A popular kind of clamoring for trying to override the decision-making of corporate owners if they weren't protected and didn't have rights to, to have their freely entered into contracts observed, that you could have somebody coming in and saying, we don't like what that corporation's doing, so we're gonna, tell them they can't do it. And
Right.
so I guess that political interference was an issue, but there are other. It's a different. Another possibility that one might want to consider is that there was a kind of competition during the 19th century to get corporations to locate their headquarters in one state versus another.
Sure.
And they could compete was, sort of race to the bottom, where you could say, well, we'll give you more rights in this state if you come locate in our state.
Which Amazon just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, they want more economic, they want more corporations that they can tax that are homed in their particular state. So, New Jersey and Delaware sort of won that competition by giving them most lax kind of corporate chartering. But that's a somewhat issue from, that's state law versus the kind of Supreme Court upholding sort of corporate. But the two are very interlocked, and people made arguments both sides simultaneously.
No, that actually helps a lot. I think that's going to give our viewers and our debaters a lot to chew on and a lot to spring forward from. Well, thank you, Professor Vedder. I don't want to take any more of your time, and I want to make sure that we can jump into our debate proper, but I really appreciate your time, and this is going to give us some great context for a really good. Thank you.
Well, it's a really important topic, so I'm glad you're debating it.
Thank you so much. So that said, based on what you just heard from Professor Vedder, and if you haven't already, please make sure that you vote before you hear any of our debaters speak, so that you have a really clear idea of what you think of before you hear our debaters speak, and then vote again at the end based on how well you thought that they argued. And again, our winner will be on who ends up swaying the audience votes from the beginning to the end, rather than who ends up receiving the most votes. That said, let's start with our debate proper and go into our opening statements. And as usual, we start with the affirmative. So opening up for the affirmative side of the resolution, break up big tech, we have Akshay Nathan.
Okay, everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. My partner and I would like to thank our guest speaker, Jeremy Vedder, our moderator, Ted McLoof, the negative team of Finn and Vincent, and of course the viewers at home for providing us with the platform to discuss the flaws within the big tech industry. We'd first like to provide some definitions to help to frame this debate. We define big tech as the largest, most dominant companies in the information technology industry in the United States, including but not limited to Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. We define the resolution breaking up big tech as increased antitrust enforcement to reduce harmful anti-competitive practices without penalizing those that are pro-consumer, such as innovative strategies or mergers that increase efficiencies. Let's first establish why the big in big tech is a cause for concern. According to the Computer and Communications Industry Association in August 2018, the internet-enabled commerce represents a highly competitive, growing sector of the economy in the United States. The US Bureau of Economic Analysis shows that the digital economy is growing at an average annual rate of 5.6% every year, accounting for 6.5% of the GDP. At face value, this may seem like a positive aspect. However, it is the lack of regulation combined with this unprecedented growth that allows for the unchecked abuse of consumers and small business alike. Michael Stoltz from the Electronic Frontier Foundation explains in November 2018 that Facebook's share of advertising revenues in the United States is 79.2% of the market share and has 2.23 billion monthly active users. Their dominance is solidified through network effects because their value to users increases as the number of users increase. Network effects bind users to large internet platforms because platforms without large user bases cannot offer the same opportunity to communicate, thus eliminating competition. These dominant platforms have capitalized on their massive networks by collecting a bank of their users' data and selling advertisers access to targeted user groups in the form of hyper-personalized advertisements. While most platforms are provided quote-unquote free to consumers, users pay these companies in data. A lack of data portability coupled with the strength of network effects creates harms to competition that in turn harms consumers and implicates antitrust law. Now, my partner and I recognize that there are some benefits that the big tech industry has been able to provide. Joyce Rosenberg from ABC News explains, for many small businesses, there's no questions that they would like to sell their products on Amazon. but the cost can be hard for small businesses and companies to absorb. Attorney William Markham in 2014 furthers this concern by stating that Amazon abuses its control in order to suppress competition by refusing to give targeted suppliers access to its distribution system on commercially reasonable terms unless they offer it at prices they will not offer to any other retail sellers. It's a catch-22, making it almost impossible for small business owners to make a profit because they know they'll have to either decrease their prices to get consumers through Amazon or get customers through Amazon, or suffer the effects of not being able to access the customer base that Amazon provides. So by breaking up big tech through increased antitrust enforcement, the US government will be able to regulate these industries that would otherwise continue their control over markets. On top of that, sound antitrust enforcement must play a crucial role in ensuring that competition exists across markets, as it will start to provide even more benefits. Maxwell Meadows from Fordham University in 2015 continues by saying that fostering competition to create new products and services, to innovate on the quality or cost of existing services, and add more competitors to the fight is likely to result in better outcomes for consumers. For these reasons and more, we affirm the resolution to break up big tech.
All right, thank you very much, Akshay. And moving on to our negative side of the resolution, against the idea that we should break up big tech, we please welcome Vincent Hasso.
Good evening, and thank you for tuning into our debate tonight. Whether you're watching on your laptop or cell phone, you're for sure watching on our Facebook Live right now, or at least in a futuristic YouTube video. The big tech companies of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft have a significant presence in our lives, but that doesn't mean that it is necessarily negative, as the affirmative in this debate tries to explain. Instead, the affirmative has tried to work a frame of view in which that big tech is anti-innovation and that the tech monopoly is detrimental to our lives. But they mislead you on why a breakup in big tech is actually harmful to the United States. First, the affirmative in this debate will state that breaking up the big tech companies will solve any market issues, although that is entirely far from the truth, because as the American Enterprise Institute explains this year, the economies of social media, search, and e-commerce have determined what are today's market structures. Breaking up companies wouldn't repeal these economic realities. And so what would simply happen with a big tech breakup is that the market structure would reemerge, except with possibly even larger firms. The affirmative simply tries to make issues worse. Now you're asking yourself, what entails with a breakup? What does it look like? Does everyone lose their Facebook account? Is it Facebook 1 and Facebook 2? Is Windows having to be removed from my computer? What is going to happen to my new iPhone? These are the important questions that the affirmative has to answer in regards to a breakup, because how the current market system is set, these major tech companies have one main product. You can't break up that main product without reattracting that same customer base back to the original company. Our second point is that breaking up big tech will actually stifle innovation. A 2020 study on mergers and acquisitions from MIT and Harvard explained that they reject the notion that one antitrust case, one company's strategic error, or the breakup of one large leading innovator of yesteryear could account for a change in the tech market structure. The current market structure of the tech industry, as it has been since the 1970s, can be described as a structure where large firms use acquisitions of smaller firms for many of their innovative activities. The United States' current tech sector is able to become more innovative because of this model. Innovation in the tech sector requires high operating costs, and small tech companies often do not have the capital to do so. They instead rely on investors in order to raise this capital. But as the Washington Post has recently explained, that the funneling of capital from investors has dried up. A lot of small tech startups now are going to have to rely on hard-earned revenue in order to operate. In the affirmative world in this debate, these tech companies will simply die off. You do not allow them to be acquired by the big tech companies such as Microsoft or Google or Facebook. Instead, because of their high operating costs, they will simply just fall. And as a Forbes study found, is that actually 90% of startups in the tech industry will fail. And the reason is because 42% of the market identified the lack of a need for their product. That's the whole entire premise of the tech sector. That is something Finn and I want you to know, that with these small tech companies is that they have one main focus. Even when you look at the big companies of the modern day, you have Google. You go to Google to search for things. You have Facebook to talk to your grandmother on. The point being that these tech companies, they all have a specific direct focus. Some of them are expanding, but the point is they are not a monopoly that you should be scared of, just like the affirmative says. And for these reasons, Finn and I are proud to negate.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Okay, so closing out round one, I'm gonna go ahead and just pose my first question right back to the affirmative, because it's a question that the negative is sort of insisting that that you guys address, which is how does what does this breakup look like in practical terms? What are you envisioning when you are suggesting that we do break up big tech?
That's a great question. So the affirmative has taken the liberty in today's debate to define breaking up big tech as nothing more than simply increasing the antitrust enforcement that reduces harmful and anti-competitive practices without penalizing those that are pro-consumer, such as these innovative strategies or mergers that increase inefficiencies that the negation claims that will no longer occur should we break up big tech. We are not calling for the dismantling of companies and institutions like Facebook, like Microsoft, like Apple, because the affirmative understands how valuable those are in the day-to-day citizens' livelihoods. However, what we are calling for is a regulation of these companies to ensure that competition can still exist in these markets.
Response, I mean, what's wrong with that? That sounds pretty reasonable.
Certainly. I just want to point out that the definition offered by the affirmative is magical. It somehow manages to achieve all the goals that the US wants for the big tech sector without any costs. The truth of the matter is that if you are going to increase antitrust action, this will have consequences. And you can't sidestep those consequences by defining them out of the debate. If you want to break up big tech and to decrease their influence, there is going to be ramifications for the market, as Vincent explained in the affirmative. There's going to be costs to consumers. Consumers are currently benefiting under big tech, and we want to see consumers winning, not losing.
How do we avoid those costs, affirmative? How do we avoid the consequences that your opponents are suggesting?
I think the issue is if we take into consideration the cost-benefit analysis of what occurs when we allow the big tech markets to go unchecked, we'll see an ultimate abuse of data mining, as well as just an overstepping of consumer autonomy when it comes to making these transactions with big business. Because big tech is such a diversifying and evolving market, it's imperative that we pass legislation that ensures that it is adaptable to the way this market will change. We can't simply advocate for the pigeonholing of a market that's constantly growing, constantly changing, and becoming more important in our day-to-day lives. The more we depend on these markets, like the negation is arguing that we do, which we agree with, we do depend on these big markets, the more power they have over our information, over our data, and over the choices we ultimately make. Additionally, we've seen a push We've seen a push towards advocating for more antitrust enforcement from the lower courts, as well as other countries across the globe.
I have one response to that, which is, where are the harms? I keep hearing about these massive harms that big tech is bringing to consumers. I can tell you about the benefits of big tech. We're reaping the benefits being on video right now. We're reaping the benefits with low costs and free information and more ability to connect with each other to solve problems. But you keep talking about costs. What are the concrete costs? And I don't want to hear buzzwords like data mining and privacy concerns.
That's fine. So let's understand that in the American economy, we value competition. Now, Amazon is currently controlling 85% of the US e-commerce sales for things like arts and crafts and party supplies, and 83% of the US e-commerce sales for the category of household essentials. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem like much leeway for competition to occur in these markets. And of course, one of the #1 benefits for the consumer is a diversification of the options they have to make these purchases. purchases. You know, competitive markets lead to competitive prices. So if we are so afraid of the price margin increasing, should we regulate big tech? Understand that by regulating big tech, we increase the opportunity for this competition, thereby ensuring that innovation and efficiency, as well as the benefits for consumers, can still occur.
I want to talk about competition because there's this idea that big tech stifles competition. In fact, the opposite is true. Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, most of their business model is actually predicated on connecting businesses with consumers. Take Amazon, for example. In 2018, they helped more than 1.9 US-based small and medium-sized businesses generate over $160 billion in profit. So you see that these big tech companies, they are technology companies, and their main role in a lot of ways is connecting markets. So if you want competition and you want a truly competitive, perfect market, some of the closest things that economists can actually find to that are the price bots that exist on Amazon that are competing to make prices as low as possible for consumers. If this was a true monopoly and Amazon actually controlled the prices, why would they be selling things at such a low cost on their own platform?
All right, so this is actually
I'll let the F have the answer to that, and then I want to ask my next question.
Certainly, thank you. This is actually something that we mentioned in our first speech. So attorney William Markham in 2014 has this concern that Amazon is currently abusing its control in order to suppress competition by eliminating access to their distribution systems on commercially accessible terms. We argue that this is a catch-22. Small businesses are either forced to buy to Amazon's terms, which make it near impossible for them to make a profit, or run the risk of losing their consumer base. And this brings us back to the direct issue here. When we say break up big tech, we are acknowledging the fact that no corporation should have the ability to control whether or not competition can exist within these markets. We are simply advocating for a better allocation of resources towards small businesses so they have the footing to compete. And Amazon should not be controlling how these companies get access to that.
So my next question over to the next, something that struck me here as odd. Finn had said a minute ago that the negative is uninterested in what he called buzzwords like data mining. But I'm going to throw my second question over to the negative because certainly data mining was a big concern, specifically with Facebook, obviously, most famously during the 2016 election, as well as Amazon and Google have been pretty sort of famous for collecting massive swaths of data. And even though people are concerned with them, they still are sticking with Facebook and Google and Amazon, arguably because there really is no way to sort of have a community base unless you are using those. So why aren't those concerns? Why aren't things like data mining or lack of consumer autonomy concerns on the negatives part? Those seem to be because people have, but they're unable to sort of wrest themselves from these companies.
I would say that the consumer has all the choices in the world possible. There are plenty of social media networks out there. First, we originally had Facebook, but nowadays you have Twitter, you have Snapchat, you have Instagram. But I think when it comes to ownership of data, a lot of Americans, yes, they have expressed concern regarding how their data is used. But what we also have to realize is that this data is in turn beneficial. You're getting more targeted ads towards you, such as if you are potentially looking, I don't know, for a certain item online. Perhaps you don't know what the best brand is. Well, by using your data, you can get those kinds of targeted ads. And when people do sign up for these social media networks or using search engines such as Google, they do agree to a terms of service in which a lot of people do not read. But what's important to understand is that these corporations, they're not simply abusing your data and simply using it against you to single you out or cause negative harms to you. It's instead being used to help inform you about different things going on, different options available to you, whether that is on Amazon or other platforms such as Facebook.
So affirmative, is that true? Do these companies have the consumer's best interests in mind when they collect this data?
I actually really appreciate 2 points that Vincent's brought up today. It is first that consumers oftentimes are not reading the terms and conditions of the apps they're signing up for. And like we mentioned in our speech, while these apps are being advertised to you as free, it is the data that they are collecting from you that they are essentially using as currency, which is why in the affirmative world, we are calling for a reformation of the way our economy and these big tech industries show profits. It's not only about money anymore, it's also about the information. Because yes, while big tech is able to provide you with information that may be difficult to find if without these industries, right? On the opposite side of that spectrum, now this is quite troubling. They can be using your data to exploit you, either by reshaping your opinions or by recommending you scary conspiracy theory things. And, you know, obviously we just had the giant insurrection incident that happened at the Capitol. And of course, Facebook has played a major role in allowing for these groups to come together and ultimately institute an attack on our democracy. So when we don't check big tech and when we don't ensure that the information that they are providing with our citizens is relevant and is good for them to be knowing, we run the risk of so much more than just data security. The implications of not regulating are simply too vast and too extreme to not take action.
Apologies. If anybody from Facebook is listening, we apologize if we're insulting you. Please don't shut us down forever.
Can I interject for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Vincent offers this sort of thing where he says that, oh, you can choose any social media platform, like there's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. But isn't Instagram also owned by Facebook at this point? Facebook is gobbling up as much of their consumer base as possible. They're basically absorbing multiple social media platforms, and they're offering this false illusion of competition, when in reality, behind this sort of like iron curtain, it's only Facebook.
I think one major thing that the affirmative, and Finn brought this up earlier, is costs. Okay, sure, let's get rid of data. Pretend that social media companies no longer have your data. How do you plan for Facebook to operate? How do you plan for Twitter? This is a legitimate question, because how they make their money in the first place is off of this data. But what's important to understand here, Ted, is that these social media companies, they're not magically getting money from you as let's say you, Ted McLoof, decide to pay Facebook $5. Would we all as viewers love to be able to watch this debate? If you paid $5, $10, with the rate subscriptions are going up, we may as well just pay $15 for access to all these social media platforms. What's important to understand is that the affirmative, they're just simply throwing blame. Oh, this is negative, so we cannot have it. But they're not providing any sort of solution here, Ted. They're not talking about the underlying costs. The reality is that if these big tech companies, if they don't have this data, you see Facebook, Twitter, a lot of these companies, they disappear overnight. Guess what? Sure, you can have competition, but you're not going to have these major companies that are able to provide their services on a massive level. You'll just have all the tech failures that we've already seen.
I also want to add on to a point by saying that I agree that there are major concerns about misinformation on Facebook, for example. You can see misinformation on other apps like Parler, for example, which has now been taken down by AWS. But the affirmative doesn't offer a true solution to this. Regulating the truth in markets is very, very difficult to do. And determining what is true and how to stop misinformation from spreading is a problem that the affirmative doesn't have a true solution to. So I think it's unfair for the affirmative to claim that the negative is defending these practices when we also want to fight these practices. We just disagree that breaking up big tech would actually solve them.
If I could respond, Ted, that'd be great.
Yeah, please.
So I want to make sure that those in the negation, as well as the viewers that are watching right now, are understanding the argument. We are in no way advocating for the complete removal of providing, big tech with your information. We are not calling for the removal of these platforms either. Simply put, we are advocating for legislation or regulation that requires these big tech industries to be more transparent with what they're doing with your information. Because if we choose not to regulate, big data can then further tilt the playing field towards big institutions and away from individuals. Now, Vincent talks about how big tech knowing your information can help you by providing you with, search terms that you may want to research, can provide you with things like that are relevant to what you want. But understand the implications of these industries knowing that information about you. For example, if a store can gain insight into just how badly I want to buy a product, just how much I can afford to pay for it, and just how knowledgeable I am about the marketplace or the best way to scare me into buying it, it can extract maximum profit from me. And that's not beneficial to our consumers. Additionally, I'd like to ask Finn, what's the solvency here in your status quo should we choose not to regulate like the affirmative is advocating for?
And then
So,
if I could, oh, sorry.
About solvency in the status quo, I think that over time, companies will move towards more of a subscription model. I think that in the past 2 weeks even, we have seen companies strike out against misinformation, banning people from their platforms that are spreading misinformation. But I don't think that it's our burden in this debate to solve for that. Also, I'd like to point out, and I suspected that this might happen in this debate, that the affirmative has again moved the goalpost. At the beginning, they said that they wanted to advocate for stronger use of antitrust law. Antitrust law has nothing to do with privacy regulations, which now the affirmative is claiming is their main objective.
I'll let you throw in your last comment, and then I have one last question I'm going to ask to the affirmative, and then we're going to turn to some audience questions before we're closing our.
I just wanted to respond to like what Vincent was saying earlier, in that he was saying that the companies use the data mining in order to profit or in order to generate their profits. First, I would like to say that you talk about how there's like investors in these companies. There's no reason why we should expect that investors in the companies will stop providing money to these companies if the affirmative plan gets put into motion. Additionally, I believe that the point that Vincent makes that that companies that smaller firms have dried up in terms of investors, I think that's because of the role of big firms in taking away investors from small firms, in gobbling up those investors, because they believe they have like a higher market share, so they have more incentive to invest in this bigger product rather than the smaller product. And in the app world, instead of that happening, investors invest in a more diverse pool of investments, meaning that competition is increased in our world.
I would like to point out that the affirmative is trying to tiptoe on two different sides of this debate. They're trying to play data on both sides that, oh, investors are there, they can fund, the investors can fund these tech startups. As we've seen with recent data is that a lot of tech companies, especially those startups, they're losing their investors. It's not because of simply they're getting swallowed up by your Facebook or your Google. It's because of the fact that a lot of these small tech companies have one single goal in mind. And then their goal is literally to get acquired by one of your bigger tech companies. Their goal isn't to become self-sustainable and become the next big Facebook. No, their goal is to be bought out by Facebook. That's how the market structure works. In fact, Akshay talks about how investors will be there to save the day. They haven't been there to save the day ever since coronavirus started, because as the Wall Street Journal had just recently reported that the tech startup industry itself has lost 70,000 employees since the start of the pandemic. That's been because despite places such as DoorDash or Uber Eats doing these promos in which to attract consumers, a lot of investors have instead started pulling their money out, because a lot of these tech startups, they're just money pits. You simply burn money in them because their goal is to just become the next hot thing and be acquired by big tech. They're not aiming to be big tech themselves necessarily or join that category. They want to simply just be, I guess, merge and acquired by Facebook.
So my last question I'm going to ask again to the affirmative, and then we'll start to talk to get some audience questions. My last question I want to throw in, it might be a slightly more existential question than the other two, but I'd be interested in the affirmative talking a little bit about how much blame / autonomy do consumers themselves bear for exactly the problems that it sounds like all four of you are in agreement are problematic. I mean, you're suggesting, it sounds like the affirmative is suggesting that antitrust laws are the way to really sort of address this. But is there any sort of consumer responsibility to push back when they aren't liking things that big tech is doing? Is that maybe a more effective way to break up big tech? And if so, why aren't consumers doing that?
I'd actually disagree with you, Ted, in that we've seen pushes by consumer bases as well as, other countries or other our lower courts that have shown interest in pursuing antitrust legislation because they recognize the risk that letting big tech go unchecked, letting go unregulated, proves. The negation on this side has no solvency for the problems that arise when we leave big tech unregulated, which is something that we've all agreed to. So while consumers are responsible for ensuring they're making smart choices, understand that it is these big tech industries that are making that near impossible because of the amount of dependency that has been created from the consumer to the big tech industry, such as Amazon, for example. I can list off, dozens of smaller businesses that have recently worked with Amazon that are part of our day-to-day lives, whether it be Netflix, whether it be Whole Foods, whether it be, Johnson and Johnson, whether it be businesses like that, name companies that we are using. And might I mention that these are not small businesses either. We are dependent on these industries, and the people we are owed by these industries transparency. And I think that's what we're calling for here the most.
Great. Response?
I think that the word dependency basically means we like using it. So if you are dependent on Amazon because you enjoy using its services, or I enjoy using my iPhone, so I'm dependent on Apple, I think that there's a negative connotation to dependent. Why don't you just call it what it actually is? We enjoy using these products, and big tech has offered us these products. I could at any time say, never again. I will never use Amazon. I will never buy an Apple phone. I will shut off my Instagram and walk away. These are all free choices that are being made. No one is coercing anyone into these choices. What has happened is that big tech has offered an amazing value proposition to consumers. And I don't think that we should take it away from them.
I'd be able to respond to that just briefly.
Please, yeah.
I think that the negation has directly proven my point here, in that the fact of the matter is the reason why these citizens, the people, are so fond of these companies is because these companies have created no other leeway for alternatives to exist. If I were to ask Finn, if you were to stop using Amazon right now, what is the next company you'd use? I would wager that we probably wouldn't have any sort of idea. It's the same thing with Instagram. It's the same thing with Facebook, because the negation has painted this vivid picture that we rely on big tech for methods of communication, for methods of gaining information, for methods of, spurring this innovation, spurring all of these fantastic things. This proves our dependency here. And the fact of the matter is that very statement proves the lack of diversification that exists within markets, which is something we should all be fighting for. Recall back to our case, which talks about how Amazon is essentially prohibiting smaller businesses from utilizing their resources, which are an essential facility, because as the negation has mentioned, we are dependent on Amazon and big tech for a lot of things. They are restricting these smaller companies and smaller organizations from utilizing these resources, lest they either decrease their profits in order so they can't make any money, or they run the risk of losing the consumer base that is so dependent on these big tech industries. So really, in the negative world, there's no opportunity for these other options to exist.
I think that the affirmative is missing the point here. They're ignoring the fact that the big tech industries, and as I quoted evidence on earlier, Amazon is creating a marketplace. And without this fair and equal marketplace, in a lot of ways, you would see a lot of small businesses falling out of the digital age. We know that people are shopping online right now. And the question is, can small businesses do it by themselves? They can't. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the technology to do it by themselves. They can either be left out in the cold and do nothing, or they can sell on Amazon. And I don't think that it's such a bad thing that Amazon is bringing 1.9 million small businesses into the US, into the e-commerce market. You also posed a question to me, where would I go if I couldn't shop on Amazon? Well, first off, Amazon only controls about 50% of the total e-commerce market. But That's not the total market that I can shop from. I could, if I wanted to, walk down the street, get in my car, go somewhere to buy something. But I, as a consumer, and many consumers like me have chosen to do this, decided that it's preferable to buy it on Amazon. No one told me I had to buy it on Amazon. I went to Amazon because it was the greatest value proposition for me personally as a consumer. And that right there is the market speaking on this. And you haven't shown any consumer harm here.
Ted,
Actually, you can have the last comment, and then I'm
Okay.
excited to get to these audience questions because
So Finn,
they're actually pretty solid. So
So Finn basically says that it's possible for him and many consumers to walk down the street or get in their car and go to a grocery place or grocery store in order to get stuff. However, if you like something, you said something to that effect where it's possible to go to another place, like either walk down the street or get in your car and go to a grocery store rather than going to Amazon. However, that's not necessarily possible for a lot of individuals, particularly disabled individuals. They have to rely on the e-commerce marketplace in order to get their groceries. And when Amazon forces small businesses out of play because of their predatory tactics and engulfs the market, that is a harm to the consumer because it decreases competition. It decreases the amount of other stores that can provide products to an individual.
So let me get to, I'm glad that we're talking so much about Amazon because one of our first really astute audience questions is for the negative, and it's directly about Amazon. So the question here is, does consumer benefit outweigh employee disadvantage for companies like Amazon? We haven't really spoken a whole lot about the employees of these companies themselves, but we've heard a lot about the treatment of employees at Amazon warehouses and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about that? Does consumer benefit outweigh the disadvantage that employees might have in these big tech companies?
I don't think that this is a black and white issue. I don't think that you either have to pick consumer benefit or you have to pick the employee benefit. I personally would like to see it a little more balanced. I'd like to see the shareholder class get a little bit less and the employees get a little bit more. I think that that would be a step forward. But we have to acknowledge that Amazon does provide a lot of benefits for employees. Now, you hear the horror stories, right? That's what makes the news. But the slow change doesn't quite make the news. It doesn't make the news that Amazon is hiring like 10,000 people a day throughout the coronavirus pandemic. And that they were one of the first companies to up their wages to $20 an hour. So those kind of changes often don't make the news when the horror stories do make the news. And I think that the government certainly has a place, but I don't think it's with antitrust. I think the government has a place with taxing corporations, for example, or taxing very rich individuals to provide a social safety net so that workers don't feel so obliged to work such onerous hours or they're out on the street. I think that that is a solution. But the solution isn't break up this company that has been very successful and is offering consumer benefit. The solution is to back end the problem and to actually solve it at its source and tax and then provide a social safety net.
Affirmative, if you want to respond.
Certainly. So I think what we have to understand here is that we're not only talking about the quantifiable number of jobs, but also the sources by which these jobs are coming from. Should we choose to regulate these larger businesses, this now allows for these smaller businesses to appear competitive to those that are looking to enter the job market. Now, not everybody wants to be working for Amazon, for the rest of their lives. But what happens is as Amazon increases, as Amazon maintains their control over these markets, a lot of these employees are now subjected to the harmful business practices. But should we choose to regulate, what ends up happening is smaller businesses can now hire more people because they have the resources to do so. They can opt to treat these workers better, which thereby will incentivize bigger businesses to treat their employees better. So by regulating big business, what ends up happening is more improved worker conditions overall. Now, should we leave big business unregulated, we won't see a change in the status quo, at least as quickly or as to a scale as we'd want it to.
I'd like to point out that there are already existing worker protections And also that a horde of small businesses don't pay as well as Amazon does. You're acting as if working for a small business is automatically going to make an employee get a better deal out of it. And I don't think you provided any evidence for that.
We're not necessarily talking about only the amount of money that people are making from, working for Amazon versus working for a small business. We're also talking about working conditions. Now, something we brought up a lot in today's debate was the coronavirus pandemic. So Amazon has recently been sued for denying the needed protective gear to its predominantly minority workforce. Should we allow Amazon to continue to take direct attacks, like to act in these ways? What ends up happening is it communicates the messages at the precedent that that's okay, but allow small businesses to create these good relationships with their employees. And we set the precedents and we send the message that it's important to value worker rights and value their safety and value their protection. Not regulating big tech doesn't put this solvency forward.
And if I could just interject for a second.
Well, my next question is actually for your side, so you could feel free to be the person who answers it directly, actually, and it's related to what we're talking about right now. So another question we have here again from the audience is the global implications of breaking up big tech. The question here, I believe, is pointing more towards negative consequences and asking, are there negative consequences globally to breaking up big tech? Because I think we're thinking very much nationally and how it's going to affect Americans specifically, but what are the global implications of breaking up the big tech?
Do you want me to take this one, Akshay?
Yeah, you can.
So as the United States is one of the biggest global markets in the world, we are a dominating force in the global economy. By regulating big tech, what happens is we're sending a message to other countries across the world that we agree we should be ensuring that these companies are not controlling our consumers' lives, as well as abusing the competitive nature that our markets depend on to be successful. The United States ought to be taking a firm stance towards regulation, because what essentially happens is we set the precedence that abuse is not acceptable and that abuse cannot happen under the status quo, particularly in regards to how big tech continues to evolve and change. We can only put this message forward and show our support by taking this action.
And to add on that, a lot of the big businesses that exist within the United States exploit workers throughout the global South. So that's actually a harm to the world. Breaking up big tech will allow smaller businesses to proliferate, and the smaller businesses are much less likely to exploit workers from outside the United States than the big corporations are. So it's on net benefit. It's on net benefit for the global or the globe, because less workers are being exploited by these large companies, I would say.
I think one thing that the affirmative is getting really, really confused about in this debate is they're not talking about like what actually breaking up big tech. We're talking about worker conditions now and how regulation on big tech will fix that around the world. But what's missing here is this whole discussion on antitrust, on the acquisitions. Just because you have Amazon, they've had worker conditions in the past that are horrible. Finn and I, we agree with that, absolutely. But adding on antitrust regulation isn't what ultimately fixes that. Ultimately, what fixes it is there being a consensus amongst both government and also us as people is recognizing these issues. And Amazon has worked on them. As Finn stated, $20 minimum wage. Minimum wage, I think right now federally is about $12. If you break up big tech, now you don't have this major big tech company that is able to provide those that $20 minimum wage. And even on looking on the global scale, we see that big tech has to be big if you want it to operate. You're not going to have Facebook be able to connect people all around the world without it being big in the first place, just because of there being such a high associated cost with all of the running regarding operation costs, servers, networks, all of that. And this is something that the negation or the affirmative has failed to address this whole entire debate on what happens if we apply these regulations or costs. How much does it actually pass on to the consumer?
If I can talk about worker conditions really quickly, and then if Pat wants to comment on the rest of that. So with worker conditions,
I'll let you guys respond. I'll give the negative the last word, and then we'll move on to our
okay. If worker conditions, bigger companies have more leeway because they have more money. They have more leeway to exploit workers because they have more money in order to pay fines that regulations will impose if they violate laws. Smaller businesses don't have that money, so they're much less likely to exploit worker conditions than larger companies. Even if there's a $20 minimum wage, Amazon still exploits its workers in terms of poor working conditions, which they're able to pay fines for. Smaller businesses don't do that necessarily.
So first off, I think that Vincent is right that the affirmative is missing the point of the debate going into the worker rights conversation. We agree that there should be enforcement of worker rights. There's a reason that Amazon was able to be sued for their treatment of workers, because it's illegal. If they're doing that, it is illegal, and there are laws in place to protect workers against that. Second, I want to point out that just because a company is big doesn't mean it's going to exploit its workers. You could take the inverse logic and say that there's more attention paid to big companies, and therefore they have a larger brand at risk if they exploit workers. There's a reason that Amazon decided to pay its workers $20 an hour. It is partially out of good of Jeff Bezos's heart, but I don't think it really all came from that. It's because there is an optics problem, and they want to present a good brand. So there are benefits to companies being large. I would need to see empirical evidence that larger companies mistreat workers more, because I don't think that that is a claim that can be made correctly.
Any response that the affirmative would like to make, you're more than welcome to make it in your closing statement. It's time to move on to closing statements now. Guys, that was an absolutely spectacular back and forth. We actually had more audience questions that you guys did so well that you actually answered a handful of the audience questions that were sort of in the queue. So I'm really, really proud of all four of you. I'm really interested to hear the closing statements. So let's start as we did before by turning the first closing statement over to the affirmative. So closing out the resolution of break up big tech. On the affirmative side of that resolution, we have Pat Yago.
Just to be clear, the time on this is 3 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So once again, we'd like to thank everybody that made this debate possible tonight. I'd like to start by first redefining what we mean by breaking up big tech, which is increased antitrust enforcement to reduce harmful anti-competitive practices without penalizing those that are pro-consumer. Now, if you'll notice, throughout this debate, the negation did not once ask us for an example of what that regulation could look like in the AF world. So I'll provide you with one now. The Essential Facilities Doctrine, or the Consumer Welfare Standard, being updated and regulated is a perfect example of how we can break up big tech while ensuring that consumers are still able to utilize these services. When we refine the Essential Facilities Doctrine, what essentially is happening is we allow for smaller businesses to have access to these essential facilities that companies like Amazon and Facebook currently have a monopoly over. And when this happens, what we allow for is more competition, which spurs innovation and spurs efficiency, which is ultimately beneficial for the consumer. Now, the negation has asked me time and time again during this debate, what did the benefits look like for the consumer? What do the drawbacks look like for the consumer? Ultimately, the consumer has nothing to lose here. Next, let's go ahead and talk about how we'll re-bring up the diversification of the workforce argument and how allowing for smaller businesses to increase their resources would allow for them to build better relationships with the working class, thereby leading to the advocacy of better working conditions for workers. We ultimately see an increase in a more diverse workforce, as well as a decrease in the abuse of our working class. Next, let's understand that in order for any direct action to take course, we have to be preferring the affirmative world, because in the affirmative world, regulation is the only way to ensure things like ensuring that companies have equal access to these essential facilities, that our data is being protected. The negation has provided you with no offense on how we are able to protect not only our privacy, but also our right to the free market in the negative world. So you're preferring the AF because otherwise you are condoning the abuse that has been consistently happening from the big tech industry as it continues to evolve and change. Understand that antitrust legislation is something that's hard to understand, and that's because the big tech market is so massive and so constantly changing. The affirmative here is advocating for the passing of laws, the passing of legislation that is not only reinforceable but adaptable to this change. And that ensures our worker protections as well as our competitive markets. We agree that dependency on these things isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, when these markets become overly dependent on big tech, that is eliminating our resources and as well as our opportunities and options for more diverse purchases. So you vote in the affirmation to break up big tech so we can finally put some trust back into our antitrust laws. Thank you.
Nicely said. And finally, the negative side of the resolution, but the entire debate itself, arguing against the idea that we should break up big tech. We have Finley Dutton-Reed.
I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I think it's been a great discussion so far. I'm going to start out by responding to a few points my opponent made in her closing. First, the magical definition came up again by just saying we are going to have regulations that will magically solve the problems without having any costs to them. And they finally offered some sort of specific plan with the essential facilities doctrine, which you shouldn't have to ask an affirmative debater to propose a plan. First off, this is the whole point of the affirmative, is to pitch a better world to the audience. But with the limited time I have, I'll respond to this. First off, you're basically asking these big tech companies, and in fact, you're forcing them to let smaller companies use their supply chain. First off, that's a complete violation of the property rights of these businesses. Second, this is a huge mistake because it sets a negative precedent. Why would a company pour billions of dollars, even trillions over time, into creating these super efficient supply chains if they could just be forcibly removed from that company and used by anyone else? This is going to stifle innovation to a degree I don't think we've ever seen before in the US. So I think this is a complete misstep on the part of the affirmative. Second, my opponent said that the negative has no offense. That's correct. We're the negative. That's the whole point of the debate. The affirmative has the burden of proof in this round to bring forth evidence that big tech is harmful, which leads me to the last point. My opponent says that by supporting the affirmative, you are not condoning the abuse that big tech has levied. My question to this, which I've been asking the entire round, is what abuse? The abuse of lower prices, the abuse of better products, the abuse of connectivity, the abuse of marketplaces that allow small businesses to enter the 21st century, the abuse of higher wages, the abuse of more jobs for those who need them during the coronavirus pandemic. These are the abuses that big tech has brought. Our opponents have given us no concrete examples of why antitrust regulation would, one, work, or two, the problems they would actually be solving. So this evening, the affirmative has been hesitant in the beginning to defend any specific proposal. There are a whole ton of them out there, and they could have brought them out at the beginning of the debate, but they didn't, because the issue is more complex than big tech bad. We've shown you in this debate that big tech is good by providing substantial benefits to the consumers, fostering competition, and actually supporting businesses of all sizes entering the 21st century and helping them transition to the digital age and actually compete. And third, by providing capital for innovation, a point that they never responded to. Don't fall into the oversimplistic logic of big tech bad. And with this, I strongly urge a negative vote.
Thank you very much, Finley. Thank you to all four of our debaters tonight. That'll conclude, but before we conclude, please make sure that you vote a second time to let us know what you think based on who you think made the stronger argument, what you think on this resolution. Break up big tech. Are you in the affirmative, or in the negative, or are you undecided? Hopefully no one's undecided at the end of that incredibly informative and voracious debate. I want to thank all four of our excellent debaters. Thank you guys, that did a spectacular job. I want to thank Jeremy Vetter, our guest speaker this evening, who gave us some really great context. All of the interns for the University of Arizona debate series did a great job setting all of this up. My lovely wife, which is so weird to say, for handing me the questions for tonight's debate and making sure that we actually had audience questions. And thank you to the audience for providing those questions and for tuning in. Thank you very much. And again, tune in 2 weeks for our debate on debate itself, February 4th on Facebook Live. because Facebook will still be here because it is indeed a big tech company. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody.